Well, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here and to lecture, as you said, for the fifth time in less than 24 hours. Um, uh, I love the thought of getting on a plane and staying there for 12 hours, being in one place, trying to figure out what you're going to do. My line is, there aren't enough good movies. And so, this has been an experience equal to that. I just want you to know that. So I told Richard Fountain, who's my host, that I can't remember ever being asked to lecture 5 times in one day. The worst thought is subjecting someone to 5 lectures from the same person in one day. So some of you have probably foresaw the torture and said, I'm only going to pick one. And if you pick this one, I hope you feel like you're lucky at the end of the day, but who knows. The topic that I'm dealing with is diversity and cultural intelligence. Let me tell you what this involves. We have been dealing with issues of diversity on our campus at Dallas Seminary. We have a campus of about 2,000 students, more than 120 of which come from a variety of countries, plus we have our own ethnic mix from within the United States. And we've been lately very concerned about how to make sure that the experience that all our students have reflects what the experience of the body should be like. And really, how do we develop leaders who will communicate in their churches in such a way that the issue of diversity is not a divisive issue, which it often is, and by this I mean ethnic diversity, as opposed to producing people who are capable to move about culturally. As our world changes and as people move, there's a huge diaspora movement, as you all know. The whole issue of the way in which immigration has been handled in a variety of countries, which has become a challenging issue for a lot of people, means that churches need to be able to adapt to the fact that they live in communities which are much more diverse, generally speaking, than they used to be, that kind of thing. And we deal with a problem, particularly in the United States, I don't know if this is a situation here, where our congregations are still fairly monocultural and monoethnic, and producing people who can move between cultures and who can work in churches that have multi-ethnic potential is significant. I want to start off by citing a scripture. Most of what I'm going to do tonight is not going to work as focused on biblical texts as what I did much of today. I'm going to talk about the practical side of working with diversity. But the passage that I want to start off with kind of gives a vision of where we are going and where the gospel takes us. In Revelation 5:9, there is a picture of heaven. And it says, they were singing a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals because you were killed at the cost of your blood. You have purchased for God persons from every tribe, language, people, and nation. So this afternoon in the last session that we did, I made a point about the fact that the gospel is aimed at reconciliation. That reconciliation is a testimony to the work of restoration that God is doing in our creation. And this passage reaffirms that because it depicts the death of Christ as being about purchasing people from God who come from literally every tribe and nation. And so if this is what God is about and this is what God is committed to, then we ought to have churches and people that are reflective of this kind of divine commitment. And the beauty of the passage I'm going to cite is they both represent verse 9. In Revelation 7:9, we get this picture. After these things I looked here, and here was an enormous crowd that no one could count, made up of persons of every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, dressed in long white robes and with palm branches in their hands. Probably the biggest choir ever to be assembled. But nonetheless, another picture of the multi-ethnic nature of where the church is headed. Well, if the church is headed to be, and part of Christ's work is to be about reconciliation, then thinking through the role of diversity and what I'm going to call cultural intelligence, and I'll define that in just a minute, is an important part of thinking through what it is that the church is to be and to reflect. And certainly it is a terrific opportunity to testify to the world that the experience of Christ is not merely a privatized experience that we have between me and my God, but is a corporate experience designed to reflect a restoration and a reconciliation and a regathering of that for which we were all created when we were all made in the image of God. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about diversity. I'm going to talk about two ways in which diversity gets discussed, or two ways one can talk about it. And then I'm going to turn my attention to focusing a little bit on one of those ways, what I'm going to call identity politics, which is kind of having a particularly ethnically focused way of approaching things. And then I'm going to talk about developing cultural intelligence and some of the things that we've gone through at Dallas to try and deal with this area, which is problematic in that I don't know of a single institution that takes this on as a focus that doesn't go through some turbulent waters as they negotiate the differences that exist between people and trying to come to some level of mutual understanding. I'm aware of at least 3 institutions in the United States in the last 3 years that have tried to walk into this territory and have in the process been somewhat traumatized by the process, because it's not an easy one. And we're going to talk about how to think about that and how to work through that. And then I am going to have some time for question and answers at the end of our time together. So let me start off by talking about the 2 paths. Perhaps the most common way to talk about the issue of diversity is to dive into the area of identity politics. Identity politics is the idea that each ethnic group has its own identity and its own self-understanding that is to direct and be the focus of their experience as they interact with other ethnic groups. And whether we think about black politics or Hispanic politics, whatever group it may be, the point is to assert the value and worth of your own ethnic identity in the midst of the variety of ethnic identities that are around. There is something to be said for this. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But it also comes with some perils that I think we also have to face up to as we think about it. A second path that I'm going to talk about is what I'm going to call cultural appreciation and cultural intelligence. This is developing in people an ability to appreciate the variety of ethnic groups that they have to deal with and that they face, and how to think about forming that cultural appreciation and that cultural intelligence. And the story that I'm going to tell you tonight is basically about developing that kind of cultural appreciation or cultural intelligence. I don't think you'll find this phrase anywhere. I may be wrong, but as we were working on this at Dallas and we realized that the term diversity had acquired some baggage, and particularly negative baggage, which meant that when you raised the issue of diversity, people automatically got defensive. Their phaser shields went up, and they have what I like to call a Star Trek moment, which means that it's hard to communicate with them because their phaser shields and their defensiveness goes up. We were trying to think, well, what other term can we use to kind of describe what we're after? And it became clear to us that developing an appreciation of the variety of cultures of which the body of Christ is made up, and developing an intelligence about that variety of culture, allowing each culture to kind of have its own shape and form, which is why God created us with variety on the one hand, and yet not allowing that unique shape and form to get in the way of our ultimate unity is part of what we were about. And so that was our goal. As I think about the benefits and limits of identity politics, we inevitably walk into an area that is problematic and yet often gets discussed when the issue of race comes up, and that is the idea of privilege. In the United States, this gets defined primarily in terms of white privilege. Sometimes it's connected to the ideas of colonialization, which is another theme that often comes alongside the discussion of race. And white privilege is basically the recognition, at least in huge parts of the West and cultures associated with the West, of the advantage that being white automatically brings to certain people, and thus the disadvantage that it brings to other people as a result. Sometimes white privilege is defined as racist, but I'm going to talk about the term racism in just a second and try and define it clearly for us so we understand what it does and doesn't mean and how people use it. But the issues of privilege and the realities of privilege, I think, are hard to deny. In certain contexts, you have an inherent advantage automatically because of the color of your skin. And when a person says, I do not see race, or I do not interact with persons on the basis of race, this does not acknowledge the way in which privilege primarily works. And privilege does not primarily work so much through what individuals do as the way corporate structures react to issues of race. That's an important distinction, and I'm going to be pressing that as we talk further along. Part of the issue of privilege is understanding how my experience is not necessarily their experience. And although this is hard to accept for many people, it's not as hard to accept when you go through the experiences of a variety of people as it might initially appear. I host a podcast called The Table through the seminary, and one of the things that we do on a weekly basis is release issues that discuss the connection between God and culture. In fact, the opening line of the podcast every time is, "Welcome to the table," where we discuss issues of God and culture. And in the midst of that series of podcasts, some of what we have done has dealt with the issues of race and diversity. And I want to highlight one podcast in particular. About a year and a half ago, I interviewed Tony Evans. The center has been working on diversity on our campus for about 2 years. We started with focus groups and then went on from there. And early on, I had Tony Evans come and do an interview with. Tony Evans is a very prominent African-American pastor. He pastors a megachurch, Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship in Dallas, attended by multiple thousands on any given Sunday. He is a national African-American leader and happens to be a graduate of Dallas Seminary. In fact, he's on our board. And so I had him in. He's a good friend. We get together periodically to talk about what's going on culturally in general and that kind of thing. And very early on in the interview, the podcast was entitled "Being Black in America." And so very early on in the podcast, I asked him this question: Tony, tell me what I, as an Anglo, don't get about being black in America. And he proceeded for the next 5 to 6 minutes, without interruption, to go through a series of experiences that African Americans have on a regular basis that I, as a white person, rarely experience. He began with the illustration of driving through a very rich part of Dallas, known as Highland Park, and being pulled over by a policeman simply for driving through the area, with the policeman asking where he was going and what was he doing in this part of the city. He was actually on his way to lead a Bible study at a person who owned a home in Highland Park. But he was pulled over simply on the basis of his race because he was traveling through this part of town. And I had to say to him, nope, I've never had that experience. I've never driven through a particular part of town, have a policeman pull me over, and I've had policemen pull me over for speeding. I've done that, I've been there, okay? But I've never had a policeman pull me over and ask me, what are you doing in this part of town? I've never had the experience of walking down the street and having someone cross across the street and go over the other side in order to avoid me because they were afraid of walking past me because of the color of my skin. He's had that experience. And he went through a series of these, endless kinds of things. Let me give you some other examples. In early May, I was at a meeting, conference in Florida. Key Largo, we happened to be at a meeting at a well-to-do resort. It was a meeting of Jewish and Christian leaders from across the not across the country, across the globe. About a dozen of us. Two of the people in the group were African Americans. One of the African Americans was a very prominent pastor from Atlanta. He was in the bar the first night. We were meeting over across a couple of days. He's in the bar the first night, and someone walked up to him and assumed that he was a baseball player or a sports figure. Okay? Because that's the only way he possibly could have been at this exclusive resort, was to have been a sports figure. Of course, he was a, everyday pastor. He told us about that story the next morning after he experienced it. There was a gal who talked about being at hotels, she travels and speaks, and being in hotels and having people assume that she's part of the waitress staff simply because of the color of her skin. And again, these are experiences. I've never had anyone walk up to me at a bar and say, "What professional sports team do you play for?" I can't imagine why they haven't asked that question. And so there are these series of experiences that people have. They're sometimes called microaggressions. Okay? They are an experience that is a result simply of a person stereotyping you on the basis of your skin color and the assumptions that they have about what it is that your race is about. That kind of thing. These are all examples of the kind of privilege that white people have because they don't have these kinds of experiences, generally speaking, that blacks and others have. So this is part of understanding that my experience is not necessarily their experience. The whole experience of what it means to be a black person in the United States, be pulled over by a cop, be viewed with suspicion early on, some of which have triggered some of the incidents that you've probably heard about where blacks have been shot on the assumption that they were dangerous. And in fact, when they examine the body after the black person has been shot, there's no weapon to be found or anything else. The assumption of malice is in the head of the police officer, that kind of thing. That's an experience I generally don't experience as a white person. So these are the kinds of things that have developed into a kind of, as a reaction, a kind of identity politics that says there are certain experiences that are unique to who we are as people because of the way we're seen or viewed or understood that end up being stereotypes. Now, this is not simply limited to people of a particular race or particular color. This is not limited simply to black people. I've seen stereotypes carried over actually to other ethnic groups. Perhaps the most standard ethnic group where you might be familiar with this kind of experience is the way Jewish people are viewed in relationship to the, being astute with money or something like that. It's another example of the same kind of thing, not applied to a black person. We regularly stereotype certain races, and in doing so, in generalizing about them, we create these tensions and these barriers that then manifest themselves in a variety of ways. So one of the advantages of identity politics is it comes to grips with this. It tries to explain it. It also tries to create some level of pride and assertion in the particular ethnic minority that you're a part of, because the last time I checked, none of us selected our ethnicity. We didn't turn on the computer one day when we were little in diapers and said, I want to be white, or I want to be black, or I want to be a Kiwi, or I want to be Indian, or I want to be an American Indian. No, we inherit the race that we get, and it's something we didn't have control over. So this identity politics helps people to some degree try and negotiate their way through life and the circumstances in which they find themselves in, and in some cases dealing with the privilege that they face. But there also is a problem with identity politics. And the problem with identity politics is that it can develop a loyalty that's much like the dangers that can come from an excessive nationalism. And that is that it can become an exclusive kind of club, a separatistic kind of club, in which the only people that I trust or the only people that I'll engage with are people who are of like ethnicity. Or the only people who I claim can understand me are people of like ethnicity, that kind of thing. That sows the potential for separation and for distinction that can eat at the unity that can happen, that has the potential to happen in the church because we have the Spirit of God. So there are benefits to identity politics, but there are also limitations. To me, a better way to walk into this area, although I think there is some value in identity politics, is to pursue what I've called cultural appreciation or cultural intelligence. And this is developing an ability to understand where other people of other races are coming from, and to be able to listen and develop the ability to listen well to what their experience is that's different from your own experience. It is developing the ability not to assume that the way in which you experience a culture is the way someone of a different background experiences that same culture. And this takes patience, because it requires a little bit of imagination and sensitivity and empathy and understanding, which generally speaking we're slow as humans to develop. It never comes easily, because wrapped up in it are stories that sometimes are, how can I say, critical of the way in which one group treats another group. As I've already said, it requires listening. It requires really listening with an ear, not to defend what's taken place and not to move into that mode too quickly, but to really try and understand how someone else's experience is very different from your own. And it requires not being defensive about what it is that you hear. I remember a conversation that I had with our chaplain. This was in the last year. Great guy from Georgia, from the deep South. Okay, he was a good old boy from the deep South of the United States of America. Okay, if you talk to him in a church, he would be preaching from the pulpit. Okay, so but anyway, so he, dear guy from Georgia, and the word racism got thrown at him, having been from Georgia, and he was caught out. And so we were talking after a diversity chapel on our campus one day, and he was telling me about this conversation, and I threw him off. And his reaction was, "Look, I don't see myself as a racist, and I just don't understand where this charge is coming from." And what I said to him was this, and this was as a result of a lot of the work that we've done at the center in interacting with people of different races and how this terminology gets used. I said to him, Joe, that's his name. I said, Joe, this is not about you personally. When they say you're racist, they're not saying you personally are a racist. There are two kinds of racism. There's what we call an active and malicious racism, the kind of racism that gets connected with being a member of, in the United States, what we call the Ku Klux Klan, which is known as a white supremacist organization, that kind of thing. That's an active racism. But the racism that they're talking about is more a passive racism. It is the recognition that there are certain structures and systems in the way our culture operates that automatically gives access to certain people or makes access easier for certain people and makes it harder for others. And when they talk about your culture being racist, they're not talking about that in relationship to you personally. They're talking about that in relationship to the background of what produced things like our Civil War. And this he took well. He didn't take it defensively. He found that distinction between what I call kind of an active racism and a corporate or passive racism very, very important. And sometimes when the term racist gets used, it's being used not in that active, malicious sense, but more from a corporate sense. And generally speaking, Christians have been slow to separate their own behavior from the behavior of structures that do operate much more impersonally, that produce the different kinds of experiences I began to describe, and that therefore, as a result, produce this sense of some groups of being pushed down. And some of this ends up being very unconscious. This last year we had a chapel in which we handed over to our African American students to let them talk about their experience on campus. This is important. It was important for our students to hear what the different experience of some of our minority students was. And one of the examples of a microaggression is an illustration I'll never forget. This was a second year African American student who talked about walking into class in the dead of winter. Now our winter is your summer, so this was sometime in January for us. So if you're thinking January in New Zealand, you know, in 80, 90 degrees, or I guess you're in centigrade and not Fahrenheit, for the upper 20s or mid to upper 30s, okay? And you're thinking about those temperatures, this won't work, okay? We're more like where you are now, okay? We're in single digits in centigrade, and at Dallas sometimes we get 2-0 or below 0 in centigrade, and in fact sometimes it snows and sometimes we have ice storms. And so this particular day was a particular cold day, and this African American student had a baseball cap on because it was cold, and if you looked at his mane, which is very much like mine, he was not equally blessed, if I can put it that way. So he was partially bald as a student, and he was cold. And so he went in with his baseball cap into class. We have a dress code. And the faculty member promptly told him, actually he had a beanie on, I'm going to tell the story wrong otherwise, one of those wool caps that you put on your head. And a faculty member promptly told him to take it off because he wasn't appropriately dressed. He came back 2 days later, because we have classes on Tuesday, Thursday, and Wednesday, Friday. Came back 2 days later, same situation, had his beanie on because it was cold outside, wanted to wear it in class because his head was still cold, and once again, the faculty member told him to take off the beanie. The next week, it was still cold. By this time, the black student had gotten the message he wasn't going to wear a beanie in class, but a white student walked in with a baseball cap on. And the faculty member said nothing to the white student. And he noted that. And then he told us about it in chapel. And he said, these are little subtle things that generally speaking you may not notice, but it's something that we notice immediately. The inequity, if I can say it this way, of the way we're being treated in relationship to the rules. Where we're being asked to enforce them, or they're enforced in our case, but they're ignored or bypassed in the case of another. I fully expect that the faculty member about whom this story was told, he didn't name who the faculty member was because he was being gracious, but I fully expect that the faculty member is probably totally unaware that he does this. And yet it's an example, it's a subtle example, but a million little bites hurt. Now I'm watching your faces, and I'm watching some of the minorities in here shake their heads. So where do you develop, how can you begin to develop a sensitivity so that you begin to become aware of these things? What I want to do with the rest of my time is kind of tell you the story of what we have been doing at Dallas, how we started, how we finished, and what we've learned. A couple of years ago, we began to get feedback from our minority students that their experience of what was taking place was not the most positive kind of experience that they could have. And we were beginning to ask why this was. We thought if there's any place where a student should feel safe as a Christian participant headed for ministry, learning theology, it should be in a seminary. And so we decided, as a result of hearing this, to form what would be the equivalent in marketing of focus groups. These focus groups were made up of minority students. And we began to ask them to tell us about their experience. During the same time, we planned what were called movie nights. But these weren't normal movie nights. These would be movie nights in which we would pick films that depicted a minority experience with students gathered together to talk about what it is that they were seeing. We picked two movies in particular. We've done this twice. We picked two movies in particular. One was the story of a NASA set of NASA engineers, three of whom were African American, and their contribution to the NASA program, a movie that the culture was only comfortable enough to produce in the last few years, even though the experiences that we're talking about date back to the 1960s, right after the Civil War movement. When we made the announcement that this was going to be our first movie, the African American community, some of the African American community on our campus pushed back. They actually asked us not to show the movie. We had a 2-hour meeting with our group to explain why. And they basically said that one of the most basic scenes in the movie, in which the key figure, the key star in this movie, was Kevin Costner, who played the guy who ran the what would you call it, the communications room for the launch. And he was the one who was supervising some of these women who had been brought in, not really willingly, but because they needed someone who had a particular skill. And one of the African Americans was very adept at math and was brought in to try and help solve some of the launch and rocket problems that they were dealing with from a mathematical point of view. Anyway, one of the key scenes, which turns him into kind of a savior from those who knew the history of what happened at NASA, never actually took place. So after a 2-hour discussion with our focus group, we decided to go ahead and share the movie, but we decided to have the discussion rotate around this idea. How is it that someone can watch a movie like this, and generally speaking, the white community in the United States responded very favorably to this movie. They liked it. And the African American community was left, at least many people, uncomfortable with it. How is it that people can look at the same thing and have two very different reads on the same thing? And that's what our discussion rotated around. And so students, white and black, got to be able to hear from the other ethnicity how they were viewing this piece, which was exactly the same in terms of how it was presented to everybody, but was producing very different reactions, and we were analyzing why that was. It was an interesting evening of give and take with the group. As we proceeded, we were seeking to build a reading list. One of the complaints that we were getting from our minority students was that all the theology that we were reading, or much of it, was very white, Western, European, or North American, with hardly any minority representatives anywhere in our 4-year curriculum. Now, 4 years is a lot of time, and 120 hours is a lot of classwork. So how is it that you could go through all that and not be exposed to the writings of a variety of people of minority background to talk about their Christian experience? It's a good question. It's a fair question. So we were in the process of developing a reading list that would help with this, with their help. And once we developed this first go-around on our reading list, I tested it with the staff at the Hendricks Center. We have about 7 or 8 people who work with us, mostly young students, so it's a reflection of the student body. We have some international representation. My top assistant, who works with me very closely on the podcast, is Filipino, although he's lived in the United States for much of the last 15 years. And we had a Hispanic gal on the staff at that point. We had a Korean as well as a Canadian. And because that reflects just the mix of what we have on campus, we have several countries represented in our student body, and over 12% of our student body is international. Another 10% is African American, and then another significant probably 8 to 10% is Asian and or Hispanic. So, that's a third of our student body. So we had this mix, and we began to build these readings, but we built these readings with a focus in particular on the African American problem, which is particularly unique in the United States. And generally speaking, it didn't go over very well. It didn't go over very well because the problem was perceived to be a unique two-ethnic group problem. So we went back to the drawing board. And what we did with the reading list was to change it. And we changed it. We kept the African American stuff that we had. But then we began to read about Hispanics and Hispanic culture. We began to read about Asian and Asian culture. We actually read Asian culture from a variety of perspectives because the Asian culture has been with us, as the Hispanic culture has, for several generations. You have two kinds of Asians present, generally speaking, in the United States. People who are first or second generation, who have their own unique dynamic because their parents come over, being Asian, raising them Asian, generally speaking, going to an Asian-speaking primary language church with English coming alongside. Their kids grow up in America, and what happens is their kids are Americanized as they grow up. English becomes their primary language. They become enculturated to American culture. That creates some dissonance with their parents, but they actually also don't quite fit into normal American culture because they're Asian. They become dislocated in the second generation with all kinds of special problems that come with that. So we had readings to talk about that kind of an experience. We had readings to talk about the unique Hispanic experience. We pulled in readings from our indigenous culture, ethnic group, American Indians, to talk about what their experience is, both inside and outside the church. We had readings from Caribbean blacks, which is not the same experience as an American, African American. We brought in readings directly from the African experience as well. We had students who had Ukrainian Eastern European background. We did some readings from there as well. We did some work in other Asian cultures as well. And by the time we were done, we had 9 or 10 different cultures represented in our readings. When we took our staff through that set of readings, we didn't have a problem. Here's why. As they read through every minority group had a similar problem with being a minority group in a privileged context. And they described it very vividly, so that it didn't matter whether you were black, brown, yellow, or whatever, okay? There was a certain thing that was consistently happening across those readings, and you couldn't deny it. The other thing that happened with those readings that also helped us was each one of those groups had peculiar problems related to their ethnicity and their ethnic background. Things that they didn't share with the other ethnic groups, but things that they had to cope with that made their experience different than the majority experience. So what I'm saying to you is what these readings did because of their variety and because of their similarity was create sensitivities. They created sensitivities on two levels. There was something in common happening across all the groups, and there was something unique about each one of the groups and their own histories and their own cultural phenomena, etc. One of the other things that we've done as a part of this is to have cultural focus chapels, where we actually interview people of a given background and we let them share their experience with the student body, much like the African American group that I talked about. At the end of this last school year that we had, in our spring, in May, we interviewed 3 Asian students. One was a student from Taiwan, the other was a second generation American student, and the third was a student from Korea who was with us to try and get the variety of Asian experiences in the mix as well. These chapels run for about a half an hour for us. About 20 minutes of it is me interviewing these students about their experience, what it's like to be an Asian overseas student or a local Asian student in American culture on the one hand and on seminary campus on the other. What their experience was like, the kinds of questions that they get asked. There was a little video that we played before one of these. We've done this twice with the Asian group. And the first video is a little bit humorous because it's a jogging white male meeting a jogging Korean female. And some of you may have seen this. It's a pretty widespread video. And so the guy asked the gal, they're standing after each having run for a while, and they're just trying to catch their breath. And so the white male asks the Korean female, where are your people from? And she answers, from the United States. No, where were you born? She says, San Diego. Okay? All right? And the whole conversation is just this huge cultural disconnect. And eventually, after 4 or 5 questions, he gets the answer that she's Korean, that he had been fishing for from the beginning, because he immediately recognized, she wasn't like him. And it launches into this cross-cultural communication exercise that has both humor and a point to be made at the same time. So here is kind of what we have, how we're finishing. We're on the edge. Right now, we're taking this reading list through a panel that is made up of multiple minorities on our campus and multiple minority staff on our campus to get their feedback. In fact, that meeting is happening 1 week from tomorrow on July 25th in the States. My staff is doing it while I'm away. And it's an all-day meeting to talk our way through this reading list. Our hope is when it's all done to release it to our student body and to our faculty as a way of helping to develop sensitivity and understanding about some of the varieties of cultures that exist on our campus and what their experience is like, and also as a way of recommending certain kinds of readings to our faculty, because many of our faculty, because they're Anglo, because they've been trained in a traditional way, actually don't know where many of these resources are that discuss some of these issues and that do so with some level of balance and sensitivity. So what have we learned? Learned a couple of things. First thing that we've learned is nothing beats listening. Yeah. And by that I mean nothing beats listening non-defensively. Even when the hard stuff comes, even with when you are charged with being things that you initially think you're not guilty of, or even when the culture is charged with things that you are slow to recognize because your experience has been very different, nothing beats listening. It's a little bit like the example I gave this afternoon about my wife. When my wife says to me, you don't care about you don't care about me, which sometimes happens, or you don't care about what I say, or you're not listening or whatever, I have 2 tacks I can take. Okay? One tact is to be defensive, because my identity's been attacked as a good husband, okay? And I want to defend the fact, no, I really am a good husband. So I dig in and become defensive and respond to her, only giving my point of view about what's going on and almost paying attention as if what she's saying doesn't matter. I can tell you that when I take that tact, okay, I'm in trouble. That generally doesn't work very well for the conversation. Or the second tact that I can take is really try and understand where she's coming from and what it is that she's seeing without my being defensive. Really listening well. That almost always works better. There's no guarantee when this charge comes as to which tact I will take, even though intellectually I know which one I should take. And I would say that these discussions are very, very similar in the way they work. But they will not be easy conversations because sometimes we need to hear hard things. The second thing that we've learned is what I just said, which is nothing beats listening, but secondly, these will not be easy conversations. If a person is really honest with you about telling you where they're going, they're actually communicating two things simultaneously that are very important. They're communicating to you the truth of their experience in terms of how they're being impacted, or at least their perception of it. And as we know, perception a lot of times is important in understanding the way people are reacting to you. So you can try and deny that it's going on, but that's probably not going to help you very much. And the second thing that they're communicating to you that you need to be aware of is they're actually communicating a great deal of trust. Because they're willing to raise something that they know is going to be uncomfortable. Sometimes one of the things that happens in these racial discussions goes something like this. In fact, I have been in numerous campuses where I've watched this dynamic. A campus, in the attempt to deal with diversity, will have a diversity chapel. The white students will, generally speaking, react, and they get away with this because they're the majority. They will react by saying, "Why are we bringing this up? You know, I'm not a person who needs this or whatever, and I get tired of this discussion." You ask a minority person how they react to this situation, it's hard on them too. It is stressful. Because for most minorities on campuses, when minority issues come up, they end up having to be a voice that speaks for their entire race. Which is something, another experience, generally speaking, a white student doesn't have. By the way, it doesn't have to be a black student. That can be true of Asians, that can be true of Hispanics, etc. A minority student will say, the discussion on race is exhausting for us. It is emotionally draining because they're always on call. And what can sometimes happen in these discussions is that even though it's well-intentioned, there's not an awareness of how draining this discussion always is for the minority student. And generally speaking, the minority student can't opt out of these discussions. Because in many situations, they may be a minority that's so minority that if they don't speak up, no one represents their race in the conversation. That's hard. That's draining. And sometimes what will happen in these discussions is they will refuse to trust you enough to bring up what's really bothering them, and so you never get to what you need to get to. But in order for this discussion to really work, they have to be able to feel comfortable enough and trust you enough to share. So if they share something that's difficult, they're communicating that trust. And if you snap back at them, all you do is force them to withdraw. And you lose the potential advantage that you've gained of their being honest. So here's what we found. Another thing that we found is that at one level, there's one conversation. There's a certain thing that the minority experience shares across the variety of races. And yet at the same time, there are many conversations because certain things are unique to given ethnic groups. And that's all going on at the same time. So where do we go with all this? What it means is that when we discuss race or diversity or cultural intelligence, it's really important to develop the ability to listen well. This is something I've talked about all day. It certainly applies in this area. We also need to respect the fact that there are different experiences of the same culture and to recognize, have the ability to recognize that. And then the third thing, and this applies to everybody, minority and majority, is all of us need to learn how to move outside ourselves, how to move outside our own identity. I cannot, and this is what I don't mean by that, I cannot replicate what it is to be a minority experiencing our culture. I can't go there. Okay? People can talk to me about it, I can empathize about it, but I can't completely go there. I can't go through the constancy of what that represents. So when they say to me, you can't entirely understand my experience, that's going to be true. But what I can do is develop a kind of empathy that works to understand what that experience is, what makes it different than my own experience, and have an awareness and a sensitivity that comes out of that. That I can develop. It may take many listenings, many conversations to hear it, but I can develop that. The same is true coming the other way. The minority student sometimes doesn't understand why a majority student is slow to grasp their experience. And the answer at one level is pretty simple. Their experience is very different than yours. And so getting the groups to develop the cultural intelligence and the cultural appreciation to hear each other without feeling like they have to replicate their experience for each other, just have to understand it or at least develop some empathy for it, begins to build the bridges towards greater understanding. Now that's at an individual level. The harder thing is what to do at the corporate level. Because the corporate level is bigger than any one of us. I can change how I react individually to somebody. But getting the structures of our society to change so that there's better sensitivity is a much harder undertaking. But here's the one thing everyone can develop the sensitivity to do. Even though it's a harder undertaking, and in many cases it's a much longer term operation. And that is to develop enough sensitivity to understand that those realities need attention and need to be addressed. The more I am silent about these things, the more they will perpetuate themselves. The more I am aware of these things and am willing to speak into them in the structures that I participate in, the better the chance that over time things will get better. And they won't get better overnight, generally speaking, because these things don't come naturally. Okay? It will be a process. And there will need to be some cross-ethnic coalitions that need to be built. But hopefully, at least within the church, this kind of cross-communication and mutual appreciation, this cultural appreciation, this cultural intelligence, can help to preview what Revelation 5 and what Revelation 7 are saying to us. That one day, God will place us side by side, and what we share in Christ will certainly dominate us, but we will also become aware and appreciate the differences that exist among us that aren't moral in nature, but are just differences of cultural emphasis, in which we can say, that's not a difference of something being right or wrong, it's just different, and it produces the variety that we have. And isn't it amazing, the variety that we have? One of the things that I actually enjoy about our seminary experience is, every now and again we have what are called international chapels. In those international chapels, we ask various groups to share the songs that they sing in worship in their own language. In many cases, they'll take one of them and teach it to us. And in the midst of that, we see different music styles. They dress according to the way they dress in their culture, etc. And the room can become a kaleidoscope of the variety of people that God has created. And frankly, oftentimes, that's one of the most invigorating chapels we experience during the year. Because we begin to get a glimpse of the variety of people that God has touched with His gospel from an array of backgrounds very different from my own, and yet a very similar experience of what redemption is like for them. This is actually one of the reasons why I like to travel globally in the summers, because I get to get a glimpse of the church in different locations, out of different ethnic contexts, in different cultural contexts. It helps my own cultural sensitivity to the global nature of the body of Christ, which is transnational and transethnic. And so, how do we deal with the issue of diversity in the church? The best way to develop cultural intelligence is to be a good listener, to not be on the defensive, to hear what a different experience is like, and to be willing, in some cases, to take it on the chin. Why is that important? This is my last point, and then we'll take questions. That's important because perhaps one of the most powerful ways that the church has to show that it is different from the world is by the very transnational, transethnic nature of the church. When we can show that people of different backgrounds, particularly people of different backgrounds who have a history of being in conflict with one another, are able to get along and work alongside one another and share the vision of the same God together and work side by side, we are demonstrating something that often is the exact opposite of what we normally see in our world, which is ethnic division. When we aren't able to do that, people begin to ask, so what's the difference? What's the difference between being a Christian and not being a Christian if at the relational level it makes no difference? It's a good question.